Thank you, William. And now to our final speaker. Bruce Russell describes himself as wearing a lot of hats. Internationally known performer and recording artist, he declines the label of musician and claims that he works in sound. These are his words, by the way. By day, he works as an academic at CPIT, teaching information design and working in curriculum development. He also writes cultural theory and music criticism and curates archival recordings for the Flying Nun label. He lives in Littleton, which I've seen an awful lot of myself over recent months. So please, Bruce, are you going to come up here and speak? Or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, is this thing working? I'm on. Okay, great. Bit of feedback there. That's nice. People asked me if I had a PowerPoint for this presentation, and I don't. And in a way, that's symbolic, I guess, because I don't want to impose a master narrative on you, the audience. If you want a PowerPoint, I suggest that you close your eyes and start thinking of the parts of Christchurch that mean something personally to you and that you now no longer have access to, or which no longer exist, or which were destroyed before the earthquake. Because for me, the whole question about a city as memory is, it's a question of experience, and there are as many Christchurches in memory as there are people who've lived in Christchurch. And I think if I'm going to make one point today, it's that I don't think that we can boil down everybody's memories of Christchurch and somehow arrive at an objective Christchurch of the past that we're going to preserve or recreate or build or whatever verb you want to put into that sentence. Because the Christchurches that we remember are all quite different, and my personal interest is really in the Christchurches that are, if you like, oppositional, that are useless or illegal or weren't part of, the consensus about what Christchurch was about. Gothic buildings, all very well. I don't confess to any great enthusiasm for them. I certainly don't wish them any ill, but now that they're gone, I think almost the worst thing we could do is try and rebuild them in a kind of Disneyfication. I think the last thing any of us want is to live in Christchurch land, the most fake city of them all. So I guess the challenge of our memories of Christchurch and the physical challenge that we have to look forward to in recreating a city is how we can avoid being given from above a city that is the best possible city for us according to someone else. I know that there's been a great deal of effort made in the consultation process, and obviously that's really commendable. I've participated in the Littleton consultation about what kind of Littleton do we think we might want, and I think that's commendable. But I do worry about what the connection will be between that process, which effectively is getting us to buy into what's going to happen, and what actually happens, because I know from experience the way these things work that, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, that what we get at the other end, there'll be a million reasons why it's not what we asked for. I think it's appropriate, as I looked around listening to the other presenters, that this session is taking place in a yurt in the middle of Hagley Park, because I feel at the moment we're all, to some degree, nomads, travelling across the face of our destroyed city in our wagons with our possessions around us. I don't know about you people, but we don't go anywhere without an emergency kit. If you want a tin of peaches, I've got one in the back of the truck, with a can opener and 2 bottles of water. And this year I've had 2 new tyres. I don't go through tyres at a rate of knots normally driving around Christchurch, because Christchurch used to have paved roads. Now, we're coming back from going to the movies in Sumner the other night, and I just about drove into a ditch that I didn't see coming. I couldn't have avoided it because we were between 2 rows of cones, only slightly wider than the vehicle I was driving at the time, and I'm sure the thing wasn't there in the afternoon. Somebody would have filled it in, I'm sure, because it just about broke the axle. That's the reality of Christchurch, and it contrasts in a really interesting way with my memory, because I keep driving down the streets that I remember, And that's almost literally the most dangerous thing you can do, because you've got to keep your wits about you 24/7 to live in this place. I was asked, you don't have any notes when I showed up today. I don't need any notes because I'm living this. There's no question of forgetting the issue of Christchurch as a city of memory, because it's only a city of memory. I'm really interested what's going to happen when we do get back into the so-called red zone, back into what used to be the CBD of Christchurch. I think there's going to be a huge shock. I'm not looking forward to it. I think a lot of people are going to be really psychically damaged by the experience of action. You look at pictures in the paper, and I just want to weep. You cover your eyes. You can't. I don't want to look at these things. Sometime we're going to actually have to go back and face up to the reality. And I don't know what's going to happen. I haven't got a crystal ball. None of us do. But you have to be concerned as to whether it's a good idea to rebuild the centre of the city where it used to be. If we're going to do that, how's it going to happen? I think that inevitably we're going to get used over the next 5 to 10 years to doing without a CBD. And is a CBD going to be able to be, grown in a situation where the people who live in the city maybe don't think that they need it anymore? I used to joke about Hamilton as a city that had no downtown, had no centre. It was just a big suburb. I fear maybe that's where we live now. I don't know. I'd like to think we can get a new CBD, but I don't think it'll necessarily be anything like the one we had. And I don't necessarily think, we look at these pictures, which, William showed us some pictures. They're lovely visualisations of an imaginary Christchurch of the future. I think we should all keep those pictures in mind over the next 10 years. And we should be very critical of the process that gives us the Christchurch of the future in comparing it with the Christchurch that we're told we're going to get. Now, I realise these pictures aren't a promise, but I think it's inevitable that we all have a utopian impulse. We all dream of a better future. That's the dream of the better future. I think we need to be realistic. That's not what we're going to get. What we're going to get might be every bit as good as the city that we had, but like the city that we had, it's not going to be a manicured, designed, best of all possible Christchurches. It's going to be a Christchurch that's made up of buildings that work, buildings that don't work, ugly buildings next to good-looking buildings. It's going to be drinking fountains next to dog shit. It's going to be a mixture of good and bad, because that's life. And I think if we all look at the last year that we've lived through, I don't think we've suffered from amnesia. I think we're suffering from whatever the opposite of amnesia is. There's things you can't forget. I feel that I'm full of memories and bugger all else, really. And I think that's the challenge we're all facing, is how are we going to work with that, work with the the lemons that we've been given, and come out with lemonade at the end of it. And it's only going to happen collectively, working together. But at the same time, we have to deal with the structures that are being put in place in order to facilitate that future. And those are not necessarily structures that are going to be friendly to our desires, our intentions, and our preferred outcomes. I think anybody who's dealing with the whole EQC, EQR acronym bending process that we're in at the moment knows that there are desired outcomes and there are intended outcomes and there are actual outcomes, which are not necessarily the same thing whatsoever. I have to say, as a disclaimer, the earthquake's been really good to us. We've got a better house than we had beforehand. It's all fixed now. You wouldn't know we've had an earthquake, really, apart from a few cracks in the plaster, but I'm getting to like them, really. A few cracks in the plaster are quite livable, and it stops you from getting that feeling that somehow you're above yourself and you live in a perfect world, when any room you walk into has got a big diagonal kind of up the side. It certainly stops me getting on top of myself, that's for sure. I feel I'm participating in a stand-up routine here because, of course, I'm making it up as I go along, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because we do have to acknowledge that the only way that we're going to survive this is is, I guess, by having that, Battle of Britain spirit we hear so much about. And I think that, people laughed a lot in the Blitz because there wasn't much choice about it. And I feel very much we're in the same situation now. So, my concern today, I guess, is to talk about the experience that we're all having, because I think that experience is really salutary. I think it's a way of a category, if you like. It's a tool that we can use to analyse how we've lived in a place, how we're living in it now, and to be using that knowledge to be realistic about how we might be living in that place in the future. A friend of mine said a few months ago, that is, when I say a few months ago, I'm not talking about before the earthquakes, of course. I'm talking about right in the middle of the whole earthquake experience. Looked at me and said, this is a fantastic time to be alive, because in this town, in this time, all bets are off. Because when you live in a city, in a society, in a municipality is, I'm a great believer in cities, and we've looked at some images on the screen today of city-states of the past when states were cities, and I hanker after that time when a municipality could be, a whole world in itself. And in a way, romantically, we all live in cities that are whole worlds in themselves. Except, of course, they're not. They're enmeshed in much larger structures of politics and, economics and power relations. But when all bets are off, basically, people have laid their wages in terms of time and money and property. And when you live in a city that's going ahead with business as usual, there are winners and they tend to stay winners, and there are losers and they tend to stay losers. And what my comrade was saying, I guess, was that, well, it's quite exciting to live in a time where those bets have just been completely thrown up in the air and fallen in a completely different order, and we're finding out what's the new order. And I wish absolutely no ill to anyone who might live in Scarborough Hill, but I do think Scarborough Hill is a really poignant example of all bets being off, because property values there are never going to be what they were before, and I don't wish, as I say, any ill to anyone who owns property on Scarborough Hill, but there is a certain frisson to living in a city where that kind of size of bet can suddenly be just wiped. So I guess I sound like I'm enjoying myself now, and I guess I am. The other time that I've lived in Christchurch through something like this was in 1981, 30 years ago. There's been a bit of talk about the Springbok tour at various times this year because it was 30 years ago. But that was another time when, in a completely different way, all bets were off. And, it's when I became a lawbreaker. And I formed a lot of impressions of Christchurch then, which have stayed with me. And I think of places in Christchurch in terms of, crimes that we committed, or, brave acts that I saw carried out for altruistic ends. And that's one of the things I love about Christchurch, is, for me, in my memory, it's a city where people are willing, or have been willing at some time in my lifetime, to do something dangerous, inconvenient, and potentially life-altering for an ideal. And that, I think, is a Christchurch that I'm proud to live in, and I think it's a Christchurch that we can all feel good about. And I have to say, is there one category of person that I feel justified in condemning today? And no, of course there isn't, because I'm not in a position to sit in judgment, but quake dodgers, I have to say, I can't criticise any individual for having to leave, but I have to think that there must be some people who've just left because they haven't got the right stuff. And I don't think Christchurch is the poorer for that. I think anyone who stands firm right through in Christchurch, and that's an allusion, of course, to 1951, before my time, but living in Littleton, 51 is always with us. And I think that those of us who stand firm right through in 2011 will be able to say, to our grandchildren that we did this, that it was a good time to be alive because we were tested, and that will be something, I think, that we can hold in our memory and look back on as a positive thing for all the the accidents and the losses and the heartache that's gone on. And I know you see that spirit with, people who are living with no plumbing. Yes, they're complaining, but they're not expecting to somehow be, magicked out of that situation. They're making the best of it. They're not, most of them, running away to Australia, thank God. It may be because they've got no choice, but when life gives us lemons, we must make lemonade. And just because we've got no choice doesn't mean that we can't make something of that lack of choice. It's a choice that was made for us, but life is full of choices that are made for us. None of us are free. None of us get to do what we want. So I think we all have to celebrate that together. Thank you.
Greetings, my name's Robert Biggs, and I wanted to ask a question about the yurt that we stand in now. It brings back pleasant memories for me. I've been to it on many other occasions. There have been all sorts of things happening within it, and it does have certain sort of aspects about it which I find very appealing to the senses. There's repetition of form and pattern, there's natural wood on the floor, and nice colours. It's a very convivial space in which to meet and to see people and have things happening. And hope does spring eternal and bubbles up all over the place when restrained or constrained, just like these waters that we've seen recently from the aquifers and the riverbeds under Christchurch. But what's wrong with temporary structures? This is a temporary structure. The council bought it some time ago, I think, and it's been used on many different occasions. And it's serving a very good purpose at the moment, and it does, it's got this beautiful stained glass, and everyone that comes into it really enjoys it. So what is our hope for the future with temporary structures for the time being and memories of the past being incorporated into them?
I want to speak out in favour of temporary structures. I'm looking forward to a Christchurch made of plywood and corrugated iron. And honestly, I can't see why we wouldn't want to live like that. I built a studio. I rebuilt a garage. I maintained a garage. Since we're on the record, on my property. I don't think I need to explain that nice distinction I just made there. And I maintained it into plywood and corrugated iron, and it's a better structure for it, I think. And it's so warm, it's almost soundproof. It's beautifully built for purpose, and mainly made out of recycled materials and stuff that you could get out of a packing case. I think quite rightly this yurt is a great metaphor for where we can hope to go. I think it's great that it's in Hagley Park and not in bloody Cathedral Square, where the ambient noise of the city actually make the experience of being in here less desirable. Here, although we have the odd plane overhead, at most we might hear the Avon plopping along outside. And I think this is a good model for where we could hope to go. And bring it on, temporary structures. Recycling, reusable, sustainable. I don't want to live in a high-rise of concrete, and I don't think anybody does.
Sally Ansley. I'd just like to, when we're talking about past remembered people, I'd just like to say thanks to people like Di, who have banged on for decades. And I can think of lots of people in Christchurch, and I take the last person's idea of anarchy, and we need more anarchy in Christchurch, more people saying, hang on a moment. But Di must have often felt, God, what am I saying this for? And I just want to say thank you to those people who say, God, what am I saying this for? And bang on decade after decade after decade, and they're still fucking banging on now. And whether that's on record or not, I don't care.
I just want to say how delighted I am I've come along today to see the series of speakers that we've had, and how delighted I am to hear what Bruce has been saying. And it's partly because it struck me today that what we've been doing and looking at is looking at physical structures and physical roads and physical things. And if we look at our long history of going through an era, I'm no historian, but a couple of 100 years ago, where people were controlled by other people. And we've been through a war in which we learnt, Second World War, that we had to all learn to stand on our own 2 feet and not let powerful structures control us. And what I'm seeing in this speaking today is almost an echo of that transition, to say, okay, temporary buildings, great, because what they do is that they allow people to come together in ways that suit their times, as opposed to coming together in ways that were brought to us from centuries ago. And there's a question at the end of this, which is to do with the whole pattern of how we as people, as the Western tradition has made us very individual, and we look at individualism totally. And I think our buildings are almost encouraging and forcing us to do that. And what we're losing is that sense of community and the sense of coming together spontaneously in ways that will be different this year from what they'll be in 20 years or 40 years. And so I'm really wondering whether the panel have got comments about the ways that our buildings can enable better forms of community than we had in the past.
William, do you want to respond to that one?
Yes, I can attempt to. That's going to be one of the challenges of the new central city, where up until the earthquake, private property rights ruled supreme and people were allowed to do what they wanted to within certain rules. I think now the whole game has changed, and people are going to have to work with their neighbour or with a whole block. And so that, to me as an architect, that's one of the positive things that might come out of it. The city might be different because a block of owners have all got together or be forced to get together and think, how can we make this the whole section of the city work, rather than people thinking, this is just my little empire here and I'm not going to take any notice of what's happening on either side. But there's going to be a real objection to it. Di probably can comment about your initiative in Peterborough Street.
Well, in our village around Peterborough Street, centred around there, the Colombo, Salisbury, Barbados to the river area, people have got together big time and are working to cooperate for the renewal of a very, very damaged part of the city. People want to work together, and it's together developing plans to cooperate. It's nothing to do with an outside pressure. It's what people want to do together.
I just want to follow up on that point about what are the incentives to make people cooperate. The new draft plan for the central city is currently out for consultation, closing next Friday, and it's got some wonderfully exciting ideas in it, but it's got, to me, an alarming number of times where it says incentives will encourage this and people will be encouraged to do that, without any specifics of what those incentives and encouragements are. So I'd be keen to hear the panel take those last points a little bit further. I think there's a strong feeling of what the ideal is of getting people to cooperate in new types of buildings in the city, but I'm really worried that it'll get overtaken by just the commercial imperative of getting something built and let and all those things as soon as possible. If people here are interested in seeing something happen, I'm sure we're all a group of people who could make submissions, but what are the submissions? What are the incentives that will get people to think together in those communal ways?
I totally agree. There's no incentives in the plan that I can see to encourage that. There's not much recognition of the residential communities within the central city. They're feeling a wee bit left out. And I think that it would be good if the final plan can better recognise need for community hubs, spaces and ways to work and incentives to achieve things. Because it is vulnerable. Whilst our community might be working tightly together, as an example, it is always vulnerable to external people coming in and purchasing up and doing things that others might not agree with. So, we've got cooperation, but you can never have certainty. We can't have certainty. Yeah. It's difficult knife-edge stuff.
One of the incentives, I guess, ironically, is economics, where the owners of the city mall have all got together and realised if they work together, they've got a better chance of creating something that is going to attract people. So, I mean, that's happening beyond the city plan, rules and regulations. Pretty difficult to incentivise that, though. Someone has to come down and say, right, you've all got to get together and this is what's going to happen.
It was interesting when you were speaking just before, I suddenly realised that submission is a really interesting word. And part of my spirit rebels against the concept that I must make a submission. And it, joking aside, I think the serious part of that little linguistic insight is that, when we make a submission, it's because we're petitioning a power that has placed itself over us. And I think that what we need is what Di's talking about, which is that we need to be proactive in cooperating and staking our claim to what we want, rather than petitioning for what we might have given to us if we're good.
Okay, my name is Maya. I moved back after the February earthquake, and the whole idea of memory was something that came to me because, all that stuff I didn't get to see before it fell down again. And I was just wondering, the whole idea of memorials and like the arch and the cone, and I was just wondering, is there any ideas for a memorial for the inner city? Is there a memorial for this earthquake? Are they thinking of doing something like that?
Yeah.
Yes. Anyone who'd like to respond?
I think part of the city plan, there's one of the 9 big ideas is for a memorial.
Yeah.
And Di was talking about maybe the provincial buildings is a good place to have a museum of remembrance. Or
Jonathan, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mentioned it before, but it was the chalice on the square, and it must have been 10 years ago right now that people were streaming into the square with their ribbons and cards and flowers and so on. And it seems to me that at that moment they had a choice of where they would place these mementos, and they didn't choose any of the traditional places. They didn't go into the cathedral, they didn't go to the War Memorial, they didn't go to the Bridge of Remembrance. And in a sense, the people consecrated the chalice as a place of remembrance. And I'm very interested in what the community might decide where it goes with these things, because it's all very well for the city fathers and mothers to decide where memorials might go and where they might be. But for me, there's a sense of, I'd ask myself, where would the people want this to happen? Where would they want it to go? Because you look around different cities of the world and you look at some memorials that have been built and they're neglected. People don't go to them for a variety of reasons. So there's somewhere in Christchurch's future there is an appropriate memorial. But I suppose as I've been listening to all of the conversations here, and I'm very much with the idea of sort of temporary and maverick structures and so on, are being built in the meantime. And what that maybe suggests to me is that this is something that shouldn't be hurried at all, that we should wait for some spontaneous eruptions of the mind and the heart, where a decision will form as to where things should be and what they should be. And if it's the 20-year time frame, well, so be it. If it's longer than that, well, so be it. Christchurch wasn't built in 20 years, and the new Christchurch will take a long, long time to come to fruition. One thing that does slightly alarm me is that I see that there's building going flat out in certain areas, and the buildings seem to me not to be plywood and corrugated iron, which to me are very noble materials, but reinforced concrete buildings of the dullest shape. I think let's go with the temporary buildings. Let's enjoy sort of structures like this yurt, which stands on a piece of earth where in 1906 the Maori village stood for the International Exhibition in Christchurch, and strive to realise that fabulous Christchurch that lies some way ahead in the future.
Can I comment? I think with the waterways being such a focus of the destruction, I wonder, and I didn't put a slide in, I already had too many, but wondered about the potential for retaining rip lines along our levees that we surface, perhaps with liquefaction sand, that we retain walking routes and the corridors of our waterways and these rip line patterns as a memorial to these events that can tie a lot of the city together. Yeah.
Right, very nice idea.
Good afternoon. It's pretty refreshing to hear that your idea, Bruce, that there should be some temporal structures and that allow the memory to develop in its own path. To have a collective memory and an individual memory in the same sense is quite difficult to retain in a city, especially with trauma being attached to it. I think what we're seeing, and I'll get to my question in a second, is almost a corporatization of what's going on with memorials. We see the city lights that are a direct copying of the 9/11 attacks. We are seeing the Astral Bricks project that's just right over here on Victoria Street, which, to my sense of walking around the city, nobody visits. Are we in danger of isolating ourselves and our memory from what's happened and losing touch with all the acts and everything that's happened that's attached to the earthquakes? And I guess that's where my question lies.
Yeah, I think I'm really worried about antisepsis. The one thing we're doing quickly right now, and I won't talk for long, is, but the one thing that is happening very quickly is everything's getting cleaned up.
Yeah.
And what we need, I think, memorial-wise, I think Jonathan made some really good points. I think we can't decide what those memorials will be, but I'm damn sure that at least one of them is going to be a ruin. And if we've got no ruins left, we've got no memory, and we're going to forget what happened. At this point, apart from a general shout-out for modern ruins, I guess I'd put my hand up to say, don't rebuild the cathedral. I'm not saying don't have a cathedral, but don't rebuild the darn thing so that it looks like it did before, because that's the way of Disney. And that's, I think, that would be a huge mistake.
Yeah, I'd like to endorse that.
Just if I can add one comment to that, I think you nailed it in my sense, and also a perfect structure is on Victoria Street with the clock tower that stopped at the precise time of when the earthquake happened. And I think that running into that idea of Disneyfying everything is going to leave us with a past that we can't remember.
Well, I would like to say a thank you to all the panel here, and also to everyone who's asked questions and made comments, because I do hope that some of this actually finds its way through to the council and to Sarah, because I think there's been some great ideas and some really interesting discussion. I've just got a couple of sentences I'd like to finish with. And they actually, oddly, although I found this quote a long time ago when we were first thinking about this panel, but it does pick up on what some of the other people here have said. And it's from John Rolleston Saul in his book On Equilibrium. He says, "Memory is not the past. It is the water you swim through, the words you speak, your expectations." And I think for Christchurch, that's probably about where it is at the moment. So thank you, everybody.